Good afternoon, and welcome to the Ocean Expert Exchange. Scientists in every Florida school and ANGARI Foundation are proud to be partnering this fall again to continue to bring this series your way. In this series, we dive into all things marine science and technology to share what's happening in the field. Today, we'll be talking with Will Greene about how he uses tech to advance coral reef science, and we'll be introducing him in just a quick moment. But first, Scientists in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The CEFS program connects and builds long-term partnerships between teachers and scientists in order to bring current scientific research and big data into classrooms in Florida and beyond. ANGARI Foundation is a nonprofit headquartered in West Palm Beach, Florida. The foundation supports and promotes marine science research and education, and many of the foundation's primary initiatives involve its 65-foot research vessel, the RV ANGARI. In case you missed it in the previous slides just a few moments before, we'd like to remind you that you can leave questions for the scientists by typing them in the chat box, and we'll be providing a survey at the end of today's presentation for a chance to win some really cool swag. So we hope that you'll take part in that. And so at this time, I'd like to introduce to you Will Greene of the Perry Institute for Marine Science. Will, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and as well about your work? Thanks.
Hey, everyone. I hope that people can hear and see me now. Let me get my presentation up. Just give me a moment. All right. I'm Will Greene. Thanks for coming. I really hope that this takes your mind off of current events for a minute. Really glad that everyone's here. I am a research associate at the Perry Institute for Marine Science, and we work largely in the Bahamas doing coral reef and fisheries research aimed at reversing the decline in the health of our marine ecosystems. I've been working with PIMS since early 2019 when I took a course in coral reef ecology while I was a student at Middlebury College in Vermont, and got connected with the organization then. My background is in conservation biology, geographic information systems, or GIS, and photography, and I've been scuba diving since I was 10. So to be working for PIMS full-time now is totally a dream come true. So coral reefs are one of the most incredibly diverse ecosystems on the planet. They make up only 1% of the ocean floor, and yet are home to 25% of all marine life. They're basically the rainforests of the ocean. You've probably heard about the fires and deforestation in the Amazon in the news, but the reality is that coral reefs face an even greater immediate threat. As humans continue to burn more fossil fuels, climate change threatens their very existence. Hurricanes and diseases fueled by warmer waters can decimate reefs. This photo, for example, is a big section of reef snapped in two by Hurricane Dorian, which swept through the Bahamas last September. To top it all off, the warming water itself causes corals to expel their symbiotic algae that feeds them and bleach, which can sometimes kill them. Unless we step in and help, coral reefs are likely to be wiped out almost entirely within our lifetimes, and we really don't want that to happen. So what can we do? Fortunately, there are thousands of scientists around the globe racing to figure just that out. At PIMS, we're working on restoration, growing corals in nurseries and planting them on reefs to restore populations, monitoring natural reef sites throughout the Bahamas to identify trends, and doing genetic research to figure out which corals might be more tolerant to warming oceans, and a whole lot of other things, including educating the public on the issues. And my main job at PIMS is to help us monitor corals and create educational visualizations by using cutting-edge technology and computer modeling to essentially create 3D reconstructions of reefs. So we have a digital version of exactly what it looked like at the time that we visited it, which provides us with data that we can analyze later on, picking up on details that you might have missed doing underwater surveys. The process we use for this is called structure from motion, or photogrammetry. And the basic premise is to take a bunch of photos from different perspectives and just stitch them together into a map. On land, this is usually done with something like a drone, but this is hard with reefs. from this drone photo, you can see that there's a ton of distortion from the water surface, and you can't really make anything out if the water is deep. So to solve that, we take the photos underwater. Right here might look like just a single photo, but it's actually a visualization that we've created composed of tens of millions of individual points in three-dimensional space, derived from about 3,000 underwater photographs. I'm going to give you a brief overview of how we can actually do that. Underwater, we pick a site, sometimes as large as 40 meters by 40 meters, and start by marking out the corners with permanent tags or floats. Then we collect GPS locations and depth measurements for those points and scatter scale bars like the ones you can see at the bottom of the screen throughout the plot. And then we set the camera to capture one photo every second and swim over the reef, staying about 1 to 2 meters off the bottom in a double crossing lawnmower pattern. And depending on how large the area is, we'll take somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 photos of that area, so we can get 70 to 80% overlap between the photos. The whole process can be done on one scuba tanker in about an hour if you're snorkeling, and by just one diver. So it's a really efficient way to collect data. After we take the photos, download them onto a computer, and color correct them like you can see in the upper left corner here in Adobe Lightroom to remove the blue color cast from water. Then, once they've been corrected, we put them into a reconstruction program like Agisoft Metashape, which is what we use, which finds matching points between all the photos and then uses the minute differences in angles between the points to reconstruct the original camera positions and the locations of each point in 3D. And that's what you're seeing in the bottom left of your screen. That process of recalculating that structure from photos from different angles is called structure from motion photogrammetry. And frankly, it's pretty magical that we can do this with computers now on the scale of thousands and thousands of photos. After the scene's been reconstructed, like you can see, we input the GPS data and depth information and scale information that we collected underwater, which allows us to measure the model accurately. From that point, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can go. We can create different products like a densified point cloud that I'll show you in a minute, in a triangulated mesh model of the surface of the reef that allows us to visualize and analyze in 3 dimensions. And then we can also make 2-dimensional products like a photo mosaic, which I'll also show you in a moment, which is essentially a stitched together map of the site, and a digital elevation model, which is a map of the depth at every point. These last 2 products can be brought into a GIS software like ArcGIS or QGIS. And this is getting into some more detailed things, but that's what I specialize in for further analysis. This is a little schematic of what the process looks like in Metashape. And I'm not going to dwell on this right now, but if any of you have questions, ask me at the end and I will come back to this slide. More exciting is what this looks like in a little 3D video. So I'm going to play it for you here. We're starting out looking at the tie points between photos on a reef. And you'll see it transition if your internet's fast enough. I hope this looks good enough, into the densified point cloud that I was talking about. And then a triangulated mesh model of the surface of the reef. And then a textured mesh model that drapes the photos back over that mesh. That's what these models actually look like in 3D. And I'll show you more visualizations later because it's really fun and really cool. Okay, here is what a photo mosaic looks like after processing. It looks familiar, right? This is what a satellite image would look like. But we can model areas up to about 1,000 square meters on one dive. And the resolution, which is the crazy thing about this, is down to about 0.5 millimeter or sometimes even more, up to 1/5 of a millimeter. So it's incredibly detailed. This is what a visualization of the digital elevation model that I was talking about looks like. The colors indicate depth, so red is closer to the surface. And the sort of hill shading effect in there is a great visual tool to see what the structure of the reef actually looks like. So from a scientific perspective, having data sets like these unlock a myriad of possibilities for analysis. First, this can simply be used as a monitoring tool for site characterization to complement in situ data collection. And we can do that from the photo mosaic and analyze by either a random point count, seeing what's under individual points on that reef, or by doing an automatic or manual classification using computer vision technology to get information about the benthic composition, what's actually on the seafloor, and about different coral species and the total live coral cover. The digital elevation model, DEM, that I was just showing you can actually be analyzed to get information about how structurally complex the reef is, which has super important implications for habitat availability and biodiversity. The more complex a reef is, the better habitat it can provide. We can also use the products for change detection if we photograph the same plot in time series. And once the models are aligned, we can see exactly how the reef is changing through time down to the millimeter scale, seeing where it's dying, seeing where it's growing, so on and so forth. The other really important use for photogrammetry is for monitoring restoration sites. Instead of measuring each colony that we've outplanted on reefs by hand, we can simply photograph the whole site and then take measurements and track survival and growth after the fact on the computer. So let's take a peek at a few examples here. This is a really cool site map where you can see individually tagged corals that we've actually collected genetic information for. Now I'm going to show you a little change analysis here. So here's before, which is, this was April 2019. And then in October of 2019, here's what that same site looked like. You can actually see that some of this elkhorn coral has grown and some of it has actually even broken off because of Hurricane Dorian. Here's an example of what one of our restoration sites looks like. So that little bar that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen is exactly 1/2 meter. And so we can use that to measure the exact dimensions of all of those outplanted and tagged corals. There's a whole bunch of other applications for research, but I'm going to move on to showing you guys some visualizations that are geared toward educating the public about what coral reefs actually look like. So I'm going to swap over here. So I have talked so far just about modeling whole sections, big areas of coral reef, but we can also use the same technology to model really small areas. For instance, this one reef ball is probably about 2 meters or 3 meters across. And when we make a 3-dimensional textured model of it, we can actually upload it to the web and create annotations. And this one I designed particularly to learn about coral reef species identification of hard corals. So if we zoom through the model here, you can actually see each different species that I have labeled here and zoom around the model. And then you can take control on your own and manipulate it in 3D. Super, super fun. On the reef scale, these visualizations are also really, really amazing. This right here is the program that I actually use to create the models. It's called Agisoft Metashape. And I'm going to take you on a little tour of the things that you can see in here. So what we're looking at right now is a model of the reef. The grid that you see on top of it represents the water level, or the surface level at the time that we took these photographs. And this particular plot was about 3,000 photos. If I toggle this on, you can actually see all of these blue squares are the locations of the original photos. So you can see that I took them pretty close to the surface of the reef and blanketing the reef in its entirety. This plot is about 40 meters by 30 meters. And I'm going to show you the amazing detail that we can get when we zoom in. I hope that the visualization isn't too jumpy for you, but I'll pause when I zoom in on this staghorn coral in the center of your screen. And then I'll try to manipulate it a little slowly so you can see it. In this program, we can even take direct measurements. So you can see, for instance, this patch of coral is somewhere in the realm of 2 meters wide. Okay, cool. So those are the beauty of those visualizations are really to show people what coral reefs look like, because it's hard to actually get to places that have amazing coral reefs. And I think it's really, really important to be able to show the public what these places actually look like, because what saving coral reefs and saving much of the environment is going to come down to is people really caring. And I don't believe that people can truly care about the environment unless they can see it and be inspired. And I think that this technology has a lot of potential to help with that. So moving into the future with this, my chief goals are to help refine the technology, refine our methods. This is a big part of the scientific process, right? Is learning from our mistakes and getting better at actually doing this more efficiently so that we can make more accurate models and then have consistency between them so that we can get really good measurements in time series of the same places. I also really want to analyze all of the data that we at PIMS have collected, and we're starting to do that. We have almost 100 of these plots, and there's so much information, like I talked about earlier, that we can actually glean from them. And then, like I just talked about, sharing, advocating, inspiring people. And also, the one thing that I didn't mention is that, and you probably got a sense of it from the visualizations that I was showing, but I think virtual reality has a lot of potential with this type of technology as well. Being able to visualize the reefs in your living room as if you were underwater. And as you move around yourself, you can actually move around the reef. So that's something we're looking into. There's more data collection to be done, revisiting study sites, picking new ones, and expanding the scope of our collection. And then I think the last and most important part about this is crowdsourcing, collaborating with partners and dive shops, training more people how to do the photography underwater so that we can collect more and more data from around the Bahamas and around the Caribbean so that we can do a better job at monitoring our coral reefs and figuring out how to save them. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you all for listening, and I'm super excited to be working with ANGARI on this. So at this point, I will take questions.
Thanks, Will. Thanks so much for sharing your work with us. I really enjoyed learning all about exactly what you do and how it helps the public to learn more about that information. Like you said, we're going to transition now to our question and answer portion of today's presentation. If any of our attendees have any questions, whether you're watching on Zoom or YouTube or wherever it may be, feel free to write any questions for Will in that chat box, and I will ask them on your behalf. Until those attendees' questions come in, Will, I have a question for you. Sure. I'm hoping you could let us know, how often do you have to go to the same site and photograph it over and over again? For example, is it after a natural disaster happens? Is it annually? Is it every 3 years?
Yeah, so I think it varies a lot. And obviously, the more frequently that you visit a site, the better data you'll have on how that site is changing on a really fine scale. What we've been doing is, for some of our plots, we've been trying to revisit them every few years. We have some plots in the Exuma Keys that we have data from 2013 and 2017, and hopefully we'll be able to go down there this next year to collect more data. But especially for the outplant sites, I think there's great benefit in actually revisiting them and doing these photography sessions every few months. But that's something that's going to come with more collaboration so that we can get folks out into the field easier.
Sure. Our next question comes from, let's see, Rebecca asks, where do people either follow the work you do, or how would they get in touch with you if they want to learn more about that type of work, or just reach out for any other reason?
Yeah, so one of the slides that I showed had some of our social media pages on it. So I would check us out on social media. So on Facebook and Instagram, it's at Perry Institute for Marine Science, I think. Let me get back to my screen there. Yeah, so it's at Perry Institute for Marine Science on Facebook and Instagram, at Perry Institute on Twitter. And if you want to check out the 3D models themselves, check out sketchfab.com/Perry Institute.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Mark, who says, what type of cameras are you typically using, and do you use more than one for additional coverage?
So that's a great question. Getting into the more technical aspects here, we typically use just one camera. We use a really high resolution 45 megapixel Nikon D850, if that means anything to you. I think that the key is it has to be able to have manual controls, and the higher resolution, the better. We've opted for a one camera setup just because it's a lot easier to handle. And we find that we're able to get really good data from that.
Bula, who's tuning in today from Fiji, asks, how do you color correct the photos that you collect?
So that's another good question. We start by taking our photos in RAW format instead of JPEG format. And for any photography enthusiasts out there, you'll be familiar with that. But basically, it means that every photo that we take retains much more information. So they're larger files, but when we're color correcting them in a program, a raw photo editor like Adobe Lightroom, it allows us to actually shift the white balance so that things that are neutrally white will actually show up as neutrally white, rather than having the blue color cast that tends to come along with taking photos underwater. So we apply the same batch adjustment to all of the photos, and it makes the color much truer to actual life.
Kiefer is curious, what is the most amazing discovery that you found while you were down there photographing?
Oh man. Personally, I think I've had the ability to go to a whole bunch of sites, especially around Grand Bahama and Abaco in the Bahamas. And there are a few reefs in that area that are in unbelievable shape, that are, it looks like something out of Jurassic Park. It's like there's so few coral reefs left especially in the Caribbean, that are in really good health. And I've had some experiences on some of those reefs, and seeing just massive 10-foot spotted eagle rays. And it gives you hope to see places that are still so beautiful and worth protecting.
I love that. We all still need that hope.
No
Our
kidding.
next question, Chris is wondering, in a situation like Hurricane Dorian, do you have to change your normal processes and go in more often or on a schedule to follow up? Or how does that change as a result of those natural disasters?
Right. So immediately following Hurricane Dorian, actually on the ANGARI, Perry Institute went on a research expedition, and we surveyed around 30 sites right around Grand Bahama and Abaco throughout the whole region to assess the damage there. And I did a photo mosaic of about 10 to 15 meters by 10 to 15 meters at each of those sites. And we were hoping to go, I was actually supposed to go on a research expedition starting tomorrow to rephotograph those sites. So we would like to revisit those, as frequently as possible. Once a year would be amazing, to see how the corals there are actually rebounding, or maybe not. We'll see from the damage from that event.
How do hurricanes truly impact the reefs? Sort of, Anne-Marie is really wondering, is it possible that a hurricane can add value to a reef in any way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. There's a few main impacts that hurricanes can have. One is they can just smash corals up and destroy them. And for some species, like elkhorn and staghorn coral, the branching species, getting smashed up isn't necessarily that bad of a thing, because they can reestablish and then cover a greater area. It can help to distribute them a little bit. But that's obviously a fine line between too much destruction and not enough. There's also a benefit that I can say is that it can sometimes wipe algae off of a reef. And algae is a main competitor with live coral for space on the reef surface. And when hurricanes come through, the corals tend to be a little hardier, and they can actually wipe off the algae. But there's a host of other problems. For instance, we think that stony coral tissue loss disease, which some of you in Florida might be familiar with, it's a really deadly coral disease. Hurricane Dorian might have actually helped to bring that over to the Bahamas. So it can move water around. It can decrease temperatures really quickly, which can help to prevent bleaching, but it can also stir up the water so much that it actually blocks light out. And that caused, we saw a lot of bleaching around Abaco and Grand Bahama after Hurricane Dorian as a result of decreased light availability. So there is really just so many impacts that hurricanes can have. But overall, I would say that stronger, more frequent hurricanes like we're seeing is not a good thing for coral.
Dylan asks, are there other organizations doing similar things to what you do throughout the rest of the world, whether it's the Great Barrier Reef or elsewhere?
Yeah, there's a lot of folks that are looking into photogrammetry, and it's definitely sort of an up and coming technology that's being used more and more widely throughout coral reef science. So we actually are working with the Nature Conservancy on developing sort of like a standardized methodology for it. There are other organizations in the US, they're like Scripps Institute for Oceanography, University of Miami, Woods Hole in Massachusetts that does research throughout the world. All of those organizations are sort of pioneering this same type of technology. And even NOAA has their own methodology for this. And it's definitely being used also in the Pacific, but I don't know as much about the actual organizations doing that work over there.
Sure. And Will, we have time for just a few questions left. So Michael's wondering, is there any open source software that is suitable for photogrammetry image processing?
Yeah, that's a
one that you would suggest.
Yes. So the one that I would suggest that's open source is called MeshLab. And it's free, but it's a little more difficult to use than the one that we use called Agisoft Metashape. But it has some pretty amazing capabilities once you learn how to use it. So if you're on a really tight budget, that's what I would go with.
Sounds good. And we're getting a few questions coming in asking about the other types of things that would be living, whether it's on a coral or near the coral. And people are wondering, do you collaborate with other scientists to share those types of photographs with them, where you may be focused more on the reef, where they may be focused more on the types of things that live on or near the reef?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we want to move toward in the future, is creating sort of a network of people that are doing this and then being able to share the data. The tricky thing is that the actual, like one of the main limitations is that the file sizes that are created by this type of data are huge and they're really difficult to share efficiently. For instance, one reef, I sometimes generate up to 200, 250 gigabytes of data for just that one reef. And so that makes sharing a little more of a logistical hurdle. But as we get better and better at this, that's definitely something that we're going to be doing more and more.
Teresa's wondering, as a result of some of your research, what are some of the ideas being considered for saving corals other than farming species and transplanting to the reef?
So I'm not the perfect person to answer that question, but there's a whole bunch of approaches. For instance, one thing that we have been working on is doing coral genetic work to look at which species are better adapted and which like symbiotic algae that are associated with them are, I said species are better adapted, which actually genetic strains of species really are better adapted to dealing with warming water. So there's like trying to identify those and then propagate them and outplant them. The other thing is the creation of marine protected areas, because overfishing and pollution is also a big problem that hurts coral reefs. And so the creation of marine protected areas can actually be really beneficial for coral reefs. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is limiting climate change and trying to decrease the stressors that are on coral reefs right now.
Sure.
I could talk about, there's so many things that people are working on. There's an amazing community of scientists working on it.
And let's start to wrap up with Bernadette. She's hoping you can let her know what software you're using to analyze mosaics.
So right now, that's a really good question. The actual like two-dimensional photomosaics, right now we're using open source QGIS because it works on a Mac and on a PC. And that's really good for us within our organization for sharing. And we can actually do point counts through that and then digitize the outlines of actual corals and things like that to start to get some information about the benthic surface on our models.
And again, I'll wrap up with the last question, I guess, and I'm going to turn it over to hear a little bit about some of your insight and the final thoughts you have for our attendees. And it could be something like something that you're hoping science teachers may cover, maybe something really inspiring that you've developed from your journeys, like you said earlier, about having hope and how that's given you some inspiration. Or if you want to talk a little bit more about the technical side of the work, it seems like we've gotten quite a few questions about that as well. Or really any other way that you would like to leave our attendees today with some final thoughts and however you would like to wrap it up on your side of things. Sure.
That's a tough one. I think that the most important takeaway from this is that, in my opinion, environmental conservation is one of the most important things going, because the world, we only have one planet and we have to do our best to preserve it. And I think so many people in this world rely on coral reefs, and it doesn't get talked about enough. And I think that especially in Florida, having an awareness of what coral reefs look like and how beautiful and amazing they are, just raising that awareness and seeing it for yourself, whether it's in virtual reality or if you can manage to get underwater, is really important to help inspire people and think about the choices that they make, to try to contribute and do your part to helping save coral reefs and the whole planet, frankly.
Will, thank you so much. It's been really great to talk to you and hear all about what you do. Again, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We're going to start to wrap up on our side of things, and Stephanie's going to give us some concluding remarks as we wrap up today's presentation. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. We want to thank everyone for joining us today on the call to explore underwater camera systems and reef technology on the Bahamas reefs. A special thank you to Will Greene for such amazing imagery and information shared about those reef systems. Once again, K-12 extension resources can be made available through our UF Earth Systems YouTube channel, where you'll find a recording of this program as well. And you will also see them in the chat box, I believe. We're placing those in there for you at this moment. For more information on the Scientist in Every Florida School program or the ANGARI Foundation, you can visit our websites and follow us on social media. We hope you've enjoyed today's presentation, and we've added a survey link again for a chance at some swag in the chat box for you. And we hope to see you next time for Ocean Expert Exchange on November